Welcome everyone to this One Planet Week talk on the theme of land and nature. We've got a few more people just arriving, so I think we'll start in a minute or so. But just to warn you, I put something in chat. The meeting is being recorded, so if you don't want to appear on the recording, please turn off your video. We'll be asking people at the end is a Q&A session if people want to raise questions, if they want to type them in the chat. If they'd rather voice them out loud, then if you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you and you can ask your question for yourself. Right, I think we've got everyone here, or everyone who's in the waiting room is now in. So it gives me the opportunity to introduce to you our speaker for today. Here's Ioan Fazey, who's our Professor of Social Dimensions of Environment and Change here at York. His focus is on understanding how to achieve fundamental and significant shifts in society towards sustainable futures. And with that, he's very much a transdisciplinary researcher, using a variety of action-oriented science, social science methods to try and to undertake his research. So if I can hand over to you, Ioan, I'll share my screen because I've got your slides, haven't I?
Great, thanks, Joe. It's a real pleasure to be here. Today's talk's a little bit about senses, so if you do feel comfortable having your video on, it'd be great because I can't even see anybody's on, and then we can actually see each other. But if you're eating your dinner, I do understand. So if you do want to connect, that would be great. So Joe, thanks for the introduction, and thank you so much for hosting. I know there's a huge amount of work that goes into organizing these sorts of events, and at such an important time in the history of the planet to be holding these sorts of things. So really good to be here, and I was really looking forward to it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about transformations, and that's my background. But originally, before I started off in this sort of social science field, I was actually a zoologist, and I love furry animals. So I'm sure there's a few budding furry animal enthusiasts in the audience, and I can see a couple in there that I know already. So it's great to have you here. Next slide, please. So I'm pretty sure you'd agree with me, we are at the end of the world as we know it. There is huge changes afoot. There is all sorts of challenges, mental health, obesity, all the way through to climate change and a whole range of different facets that we're struggling with. And these are essentially symptoms of the ways in which our societies have developed over the last few centuries. And now we're starting to see the bubbling up effects of that. And they are starting to push and shift and change all sorts of things. The advances in technology and so on are going to completely change the nature of our world. And it's very uncertain, very difficult to know where this is heading. But what we can say is we're pretty much at the end of the period of modernism, the period that's come out of the Industrial Revolution that was driven by fossil fuels, and things are going to shift very, very dramatically. And we're already in that shift as we speak. Next slide, please. And it can be a bit like this. So this was a poster that a student of mine saw in, I think it was in Glasgow, a bookshop. So please note the post-apocalyptical fiction section has been moved to current affairs. We're in it. We're faced by it. We're being faced by climate change and a whole multitude of challenges that are affecting us. Next slide, please. And it can feel a little bit like this, standing on the edge of the abyss, looking down, trying to work out what it is that one should do at the end of the world as we know it. And Graham Lester and Maureen O'Hara nicely summed this up as a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world, a tangle of interconnected challenges, horsemen of the apocalypse, black swans, synchronous failures, cascading collapses, and much more. And that's what it feels like we're facing at this point of time at the end of the world as we know it. It really is a change that is here, and we really don't know how to live and work in a world we can no longer understand or control. And so it feels quite a challenge to know what we should do in whatever sector one is working in. Next slide, please. And with that context, Really, I think we have no choice other than to think about how we would transform. Transformations are coming, whether it be the impacts from things like climate change, that will get worse and worse, we will be forced to change. Or we can grab the bull by its horns and think about how we can dramatically change our societies in order to align ourselves to this rapidly changing world. But where do we start? And that's really what I wanted to talk about today, is just some thoughts that I have around how we can start acting and working differently in this complex and ambiguous world that we're in. And I'm going to talk about 3 things that I think we need to be doing. There are many others, but these 3 things are for me quite important. The first is we need to reframe how we think about change. We need to start thinking about change as a transformational change, not just a small adjustment or reform. The second thing is we need to know what we're going to change towards. If we want a transformation, what kind of systems do we need in order to be able to operate more effectively in the world going forwards? And then the third part is, where do we start? What do we do? How do we start to think about this different kind of world and start acting in a different form to bring that about? So those are the 3 things that I really want to get across, the 3 challenges as I see them, and I'm going to help guide you through that today. Next slide, please. So the first is the reframing how we think about change, reframing our notions of what change is. So next slide, please. So we're all pretty much obsessed with improvement and efficiency. The world around us, whether it be the NHS or teaching or our education systems, we're always trying to improve things. We're always trying to make things more efficient. And that works to some degree. But as things get more complex, it becomes more and more important that these kinds of improvements to sustain what we already have will no longer work. And we're starting to see that in all sorts of different sectors, whether it be our transport systems, health and education and so on. We do lots of improvement in these. There's lots of innovations happening all the time, but often they get captured, these kinds of innovations get captured to sustain what we already have, not to create a much more fundamental change. Next slide, please. And so what we need is something much more transformational, much more in depth in terms of what we think about in terms of the change that we need to bring in, a fundamental change that will occur over time, but will bring about something fundamentally different. And that's really different from adjustments or reforms, which are about change to keep things the same. And one way of thinking about this comes from Karen O'Brien's work, which is around what she calls the 3 spheres of transformation. And this is about a systemic kind of change and the depth of change that we might need. So in that central sphere, we've got the practical kinds of things that we can do. We're quite good at these. So the behaviors and the technological responses to change that we can bring about. But they're constrained by the systems and structures that we're in, the kinds of organization that we might have, the staffing we might have, the roads that we have, or whatever it might be. And that is further constrained by our mindsets and worldviews and the paradigms that we bring into being. So if you take an example like the city of York, we can get more cycling in the city by putting in more bike lanes and putting in more bike lock places and showers in offices and those kinds of things. But we can only get so far because the cities are built and effectively developed around the notion of the car. So unless you change dramatically the systems and structures, you won't get that change in getting the more bicycles. At the same time, you won't change the systems and structures unless you change things like the worldviews and mindsets around what progress means, what development means, what it means to have a good life, and so on and so on and so on. So you can't get that change in the inner spheres without the wider sort of systemic changes. But if you do get those wider changes, you get a much more dramatic and faster change in those inner spheres by changing those outer spheres. So transformation is a subjective thing. Not everybody will agree exactly on what the future might hold, but it's also a qualitatively distinct from certain other kinds of change. And we need to reframe how we think about change and draw in a notion of transformational intent. Next slide, please. I always think the best example of this comes from nature, as is often the case. And this is the shift from a caterpillar to a butterfly. You've probably heard this analogy before, but it is really, really powerful one. So you have a caterpillar that is just an eating machine. It's there to produce more and more energy to make itself fatter and fitter and faster. And then it goes into a chrysalis. And in that process of the chrysalis, it actively dissolves itself. So what it's doing is it's reallocating resources, dissolving itself to reallocate resources to create something new. It has a vestigial bit that stays the same in the middle, but everything else dissolves. And then it has these imaginal cells that give it the sense of how it will become something different and a butterfly. So you end up with a butterfly that has a very different functionality and purpose. Now, the interesting thing about that is the dissolution process. Because remember, the caterpillar is only dissolving itself. It's not asking government for more money. It's not asking its mum and dad for more money in order to make the transition. It's actively dissolving and shifting and reshaping the energy that it has to create something new. So it's a very, very different kind of transformation from what we might perhaps think otherwise. But really, it holds that sense of this is something really different. It's a change that creates something significantly different from what is already there. Next slide, please. So that's about the transformational intent that we need to hold. We need to hold this sense of a different kind of change that we need to bring into being. But the next question that comes in, well, what are we trying to transform to? Transformation to what? And that's quite difficult to think about, especially if we don't have a sense of what that future could be, or what that future needs to be in order to be significantly different to what we have now. So let's go into the next slide where we can explore that a little bit more. Now, there are many, many different ways in which we can think about this. There's lots of research done on different forms of economies, different modes of being, different sustainable futures, and so on and so on and so on. But one kind of frame that I find particularly helpful is the notion of regenerative systems. Now, the notion of regenerative systems puts the emphasis on the underlying dynamics that would be needed for us to have a self and regenerating form of society and planetary world. And this is where the human social environmental systems have dynamics that spiral up environmental and human benefits. It's very, very different from the approach to sustainability that we've had in the last 30 or 40 years, which has mostly been about reducing harm to a sustainable level, mitigating the effects, and without necessarily actively changing what we do. So we try and mitigate the impacts of things, reduce the harm without really changing the systems that we have as those that spiral up and spiraled up and spiraled up, in terms of being able to create even more harm through the degenerative practices that we have. So that's kind of fairly key. It's a very different form and way of thinking about the kinds of dynamics that we would need. And this can apply to anything from a university to a school. You could have a regenerative school to a regenerative farm to a regenerative region, and so on and so on. So it's kind of a different way of thinking about it. And the question then is, what kinds of dynamics do we need in there? But the most crucial thing about regenerative systems is it's a system where life generates more life, where life generates more life, life to give life. Now, there aren't very good examples that I can show you on it. It's quite a difficult thing to get across. But if we go to the next slide, I think that's where we're going to show the video, Joe. So I'm going to show you a video now. It's about 4.5 minutes. You might know this already. And it's narrated by George Monbiot. And it's about how the reintroduction of wolves into the Yellowstone National Park really shifted the dynamics. And it's a good example of where a bit of change can set off a whole cascade of events that starts to generate more and more life. And that's really what I'm talking about. As you listen to this video, think about this as a regenerating system. It's a naturally forming system that brings back life into a system. So over to you, Joe, if you want to play that video. My dog loves this video, especially with the start of the sound. He's not in the room at the moment, but he's normally sitting up and pricking his ears to this one. But enjoy it. It's a good one.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological...
Not sure we can see the video, Joe.
Top of the food chain and tumbles
Hear it.
all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the...
I thought you could see it. I beg your pardon.
Unless others can, but I can't see it. I can see the picture of the slide, but not the video.
Right, let me stop sharing and try that again.
These super technologies that they're running away with us that we...
Right, so it's that one. I beg your pardon.
No worries.
Okay, so can you see that now?
Yep, that's looking good.
Okay, let's
Take two.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
That's it, Joe. Thank you. Yeah, so imagine this regenerative systems. I mean, that's a good example of how life generates more life. Whilst that may seem quite utopian in its perspective, it is possible. We are from these natural environments, and what we need to do is to try and find ways of rebuilding this regenerative capacity that we all have and the systems that we all have. The current societies that we have are generally highly degenerative. We're very extractive in the kinds of things that we pull out. We have non-circular systems that don't put things back in. We are continuously trying to build more and more and more. And we need to find a different way in which we're interacting with each other in a new kind of set of relationships and with the natural world itself. Joe, let's go back to the slides, if that's possible. So that's kind of that notion that at least it gives you a little bit of a sense of the essence of what regenerative systems might be like. Next slide, please. And of course, there are many others out there who are already starting to embed this in their thinking and the way they're approaching things. There's a whole set of work emerging around regenerative economics. that relates to the donut economics by Kate Raworth. That's being applied into the whole of the city of Amsterdam. There are notions of regenerative development, like organizations like Common Earth, or regenerative agriculture, Regeneration International, regenerative cultures, the book by Daniel Val. There's even a group in Costa Rica trying to think about how it is possible to bring about a whole country that would be regenerative, and starting to do some quite large-scale projects around shifting tourism-based economies, which are highly degenerative, extracting lots of things into rebuilding food systems and so on in these places. So there are lots of principles around regeneration that are coming out in different sectors and different scales. The key is then to think about how we build on that and take that further forward. So that's regeneration. Next slide, please. The critical question then is, where do we start? Yes, there are lots of these different groups doing different things, but it can be quite difficult for an individual in an organization or in a particular setting to start thinking about regeneration. But it's really helpful to start thinking about it from an individual's perspective and how one might embody that in terms of taking that further forward. Next slide, please. And this is really where I come to start thinking about this in terms of this as being absolutely critical for helping us move forward. It's very difficult to think about a new future, like a regenerative future, when we have limited conscious awareness of it. Difficult to know what that should look like, difficult to know how we start to embody that. And what we really need to have is some lived experiences of our connection within the natural world and with connections with all sorts of other things and new relationships to help us get those little bits of experiences that can help us build that sense of what a regenerative life might look like for ourselves. Now, this is quite similar. You might be wondering why there's a picture of a galley there, but this is quite similar to this challenge and stories of how we understand things that we have no concept of or no relationship to. And there's a story, and I don't know whether it's true, but I've heard it a few times now. There's a story that when the Europeans first arrived in South America, they were obviously meeting indigenous people as they arrived on the beaches and so on. And the indigenous people in these areas were looking at these newcomers, and they're going, well, you must have come from somewhere else. I know you're a person. I can relate to you because you're a person. Your skin's different. You've got beards. So where have you come from? And in those little bits of communication that they're able to have, the indigenous people would start to learn that they came across the ocean. But then they'll be starting to work out, well, how did you get across the ocean? And the sailors would point to their big ships out on the sea. But the indigenous people, the story goes, couldn't actually see the ships. They couldn't even perceive them because they had no frame of reference related to that. Now, another similar story on that frame of reference is my own experience of equations. I actually trained as a scientist, and I could see equations. I wasn't very good at maths, but I would sit and try to work out what all these equations meant and try and figure them out. These days, if I see an equation on a piece of paper, it's almost like my mind can't go there. It immediately shifts to something else because I just don't understand them. I have no frame of reference to it. So it's a bit like that. So you have to find some way of connecting into something to get some life, real experience of, in order to be able to start embodying something different and leading towards a different future. So where do we start with that? Next slide, please. And this is where I've been really thinking about, how do we do that? How do we start building in these experiences? And what I've come to the conclusion is it's just so important to come back to our senses, to sense the world around us, whether it be our partners, whether it be our houses, whether it be our natural environment around us. It's so important. And in many ways, our societies have become almost senseless. Well, they might be sensing, but they switch off from the senses that are around them. And if you don't have that sense of who you are, where you are, and those lived experiences, then it's very, very difficult to understand how you then build into creating something that is regenerative and connected. Let's go to the next slide. As I said, in our current world that we live in, it's so full of stuff. It's almost so full of sensuous things that you kind of can't help but switch it off. The busy lives that we have, continuously thinking about what we've got to do when we get to work, or how we feed our kids and get them to school so we can get onto something else. We're continuously racing and chasing in a world that seems to get faster and faster and faster, and in a world that we just can't get away from. We're bombarded with social media. We're bombarded with images. We're bombarded with stuff all the time. I had the pleasure of working in the Solomon Islands for a number of years and on and off. And I spent about 10 weeks one stage in these very remote communities where there was no electricity, nothing. There was really nothing there, no material goods. People were wonderful. But I remember being so heavily struck when I went back and ended up in Brisbane Airport, suddenly sort of embodied in this sort of mass of stuff that was highly consumerist. And I realized how much of the stuff that's just hitting us every moment of the day. We're surrounded by it. And you're knackered after you've been to work, so you come home, what do? You stick on Netflix or Amazon Prime or something like that. And again, just sort of, because you just can't cope with it, you just sort of dumb yourself by watching another piece, or even coming to a presentation like mine maybe, or something like that one evening. Next slide, please. But I think we have kind of lost this sort of sense of our senses. And this also relates to some deep kind of psychotherapy type work that has been coming out of the last couple of decades around how our different states, our different nervous states operate in that kind of highly sensuous world. And this comes out, there's a whole sort of concept and theory called polyvagal states by Stephen Porges. And what this basically says is, as mammals and humans, we tend to have three kind of nervous system states. We've got the social engagement state, what we call the ventral vagal state. And that's where we can be open and calm and compassionate, settled, grounded, mindful, and so on. That's that calm state that we have. But when we're faced with some orientation to some kind of perceived threat, it might be being chased by a bear, or it might be just, what we've got to do today in work, our whole bodies start to shift. We enter a different state. It's the fight or flight state. And that is a completely different physiological state. We tend to be much more focused in getting things done or approaching something. We don't see our peripheral vision. Our whole body system means that our digestive system changes. We're not able to absorb things as much, but we go into this kind of hyper sort of stressed state. So when you're often stressed, you can be in that state. And then when you get overwhelmed, maybe you've got lots of health problems, these things are just too difficult. All you can do is end up in this sort of freeze state, the dorsal vagal state. And that's a bit like the tortoise hiding under the shell. It can do nothing other than become immobile. And so we go normally, and a normal person would go through these different states. They have their real purposes. But what can happen is when we're in this hyper evaluative world, remember we're being examined and critiqued all the time in the kind of modern Western world that we have, you can often be stuck in this fight or flight state. Your body doesn't know how to get out of it. And that's quite challenging because you're then in this really rapid, crazy state, and you don't have that space to actually think about what social engagement might even feel like, let alone experience. And this is really key because it's so keyed into our senses. If we're not sensing where we're at and we're not aware of it, it can be really difficult. And it explains why many people can't get involved in group work or something like that. So there's a whole range of different things that are going on there around these different polyvagal states. Next slide, please. And that brings me to the senses themselves. So connecting in with our senses and coming back to our senses can help us in these difficult worlds. They can help us to reconnect, to experience things in a different way. I'm going to not go through all the senses, but I'm just going to start with the sense of sight. If you think about that polyvagal state thing that I just described, if you're in the ventral vagal state, you will find that your peripheral vision will be wider. You'll be much more aware of what's around you. When you're in a stress state, a fight or flight state, it's going to be much more focused. So one thing you can do to help you both connect to the world around you and also to enter that calmer state is to actually, as you go out for a walk, just don't focus on anything. Focus into the distance and become more aware of your peripheral vision. That helps us to generate this greater awareness around us. And a really interesting question you can do to go even deeper than that is, as you go out into nature, if you're walking down in a forest or down along the river or something like that, then you can start asking yourself, not just what am I observing through my peripheral vision, but what is observing me? How is nature and the natural world around me observing me? And that's quite a profound way of entering the world, very, very differently from what you were before. You're entering it as part of the world around you. And it can have quite profound changes in terms of your perception of what's going on and your place within it. Next slide, please. And then there are other senses, like the sense of touch. Peter Levine, quite well known in the psychotherapy world now, is very much of understanding. He spent decades working on trauma that people hold within them. And trauma can be many things. It's not necessarily just a particular individual event, but it can also be sustained stressful environments that generates that trauma. And what he says is very much about trying to tap into how you feel again, physically, emotionally, and in order to be able to release the trauma that is held in our bodies. And by touching, you can learn to work with those embodied emotions. By touching things in the natural environment or otherwise can really help you to reattune to where you are, what your sense of place is, what your sense of your place in the world is. So touches can help us understand how we're also connected to all things. Next slide. And finally, I'm not going to go into sound, but I will talk about smell and taste. Smell and taste as a set of senses is quite amazing. So it's very well known that the sense of smell is very much linked to our longer term memories. So that's both taste to a lesser extent, but certainly smell. And smell is apparently one of the senses that is it's one of the last senses to go in dementia patients. So that's why they can hold these longer term memories, because it's linked to their sense of smell. And so the sense of smell is really key for these memories holding. Now think of all the people in COVID who lost their sense of taste and smell. Think how that's changing the way in which they can interact with the world or have memories of the world. So it's quite a profound thing that's changed there. And I had a really interesting experience as I was exploring this myself and trying to learn how to reinstate my sense of smell. So my wife always says that I don't have a really good strong sense of smell as she does. But I had quite a profound experience as I was learning to smell things again. And I smelt something, I think it was a wall. And it suddenly reminded me of when I was very ill as a child. So it was a sense of a sort of clinical smell of being in a hospital. But what was also important was that I also had this sense not only of that memory, but I also had the sense of the memory of my mind shutting down from a sense of smell because I was in that environment. So we have these weird sort of relationships to our senses. And for me now, it's about trying to relearn to bring about that sense of smell and to engage with it. Next slide, please. So what I'm really trying to say there is coming to our senses can help us to do two things. It can help us experience connectivity and regeneration and our sense of self within that. It can help us then with the polyvagal states be more open, calmer, more joyful, hopeful, collaborative, heal and change as part of that process of engagement in that ventral vagal state that I talked about, the calm state. And that's a really key necessity for going forward in this crazy world that we now live in. And we've known this a long time. This is nothing new. Shamanic cultures have been doing this for tens of thousands of years. Buddhist practices are also deeply engaged in this, and they often use the senses that we have in the body to retrain the mind so that it doesn't become attached to what it wants in the future or what one might want in the future, and detach from the things we're trying to avoid. So there's a whole set of things in there that are actually using physical senses going back into the body in order to be able to enhance ourselves in all sorts of different ways and feel calmer and more joyful. Next slide, please. And it goes deeper than that. It goes much deeper than that, because coming to our senses is very much key to developing the wisdom we now need for the world that we are faced with. And going back 2,000 years or so, you can go back to Aristotle. Aristotle understood this. He really talked about three forms of knowledge that we hold and can work with that make up a whole person. The first is the epistemic knowledge. So the epistemic knowledge is the abstract knowledge. It's the stuff we have in written form. It's a PowerPoint presentation, pretty much what we teach in universities. This is the stuff we can pass on to others in some form. The techne is the embodied forms of knowledge. So if you're learning to ride a bicycle, you can't do it by watching a PowerPoint presentation. You have to get on and fall off. It's the stuff you kind of embody within you. It's like driving a car. You can't explain how you drive a car. It's really difficult. You can only learn it through practice. And then there's the phronesis kind of knowledge, which is the moral form of ethical knowledge about what makes a good or right end. So I could be driving a car with a bomb in the back, or I could be driving somebody to hospital. They're very, very different things. And that's a form of knowledge. And so what Aristotle said is it's those three things that make somebody wise as you develop those things, how you develop that practical wisdom. And if you look at G.H. Lawrence's quote there, my belief is in the blood and flesh as being wiser than the intellect. The body unconscious is where life bubbles up in us. It's how we know that we are alive to the depths of our souls and in touch somewhere with the vivid reaches of the cosmos. So he's saying that actually it's through that collective embodied sense that actually makes us intellectual. It's not just the individual mind, intellectual things that matter. And why is this important? Well, it's critically important now, given the world we're in, because the core questions are no longer about what the problems are. We know there's climate change. We know there's all these problems. The question is, how do we act appropriately within that world to create the changes we want to see? They're questions about the how. And just like riding the bicycle, we're not going to get through these transformative changes by just focusing on the problems and those critical issues. We've got to learn about the how. We have to get on the bicycle and fall off, get back on again, and try again. Next slide, please. And this again has been said by many others. So Phil Hanlon talks about knowledge and the great stuff that science has brought, but now it's time to bring in what is good and right and what is beautiful into that equation. Andreas Clay talks about the way in which science doesn't really have accountability. It's separate from the world that is now dogged by a whole range of ethical challenges. And also Nicholas Maxwell, a philosopher, spent 4 decades coming up with the argument, which now basically says it's not about no longer about understanding social and biophysical phenomena. It's about learning how we act in the world, how we develop the wisdom that Aristotle neatly articulated. Next slide, please. And of course, this is a major challenge, right? Getting out of our heads and into our bodies and senses is a major challenge for universities. Universities were set up not to do that. They were set up for developing and supporting epistemic knowledge. And that comes back from, if you go back 300 years or so in terms of the scientific advance, the notion and the way in which science developed was that for the observer to be separate from that which they're observing. So a science from the outside looking in, rather than recognizing that the science and the research is actually part of the problem itself, in the way in which we think about things. So science, of many benefits that it's brought, but it has, the science and technological advances are why we have now climate change in a way, because it's enabled the advances for us to suck out the fossil fuels from the ground and so on. So not to say that the past is bad, but we are in a very different state now, and we now just need to start bringing these other different forms of knowledge and knowing. And most of the knowledge that's taught in universities is that epistemic knowledge. It's a very different form of knowledge. It's sort of the stuff we can transmit. And even our business models or my salary is based on that, because what it allows us to do is it allows us to have lots of students in a class that we can purport some knowledge, transfer it in some way as a PowerPoint presentation or as a set of papers to read, without actually going into developing the embodied form of knowledges that are really needed now in the world that we find ourselves in. So when we come to work, we come in as a student, we come with our minds, not our whole selves. And that's really critical if we're going to get out of the challenges that we're in. So we need to get out of our minds, back into our bodies, in order for a fair, just, and effective transformation to happen. Next slide, please. And then finally, really in this bit, it's also really confusing, because the language we use is really interesting. When we talk about senses and we talk about minds and things like that, we talk about being senseless maybe, or mindlessness. In over our heads, I came to my senses, a mind of your own. There's this kind of really weird mix in our English linguistic language, at least, of these different things. And it never quite works out as to whether the mind sort of wins over the senses, because we use these terms in so many different ways. It's quite a fascinating way of thinking about how we relate to our senses and relate to our minds as well. Next slide, please. So this kind of is bringing me to the end of the talk, and I'll be in a moment. There's something after this, but as a quick summary where we come through in our journey, I started off with suggesting that we might be in over our heads. The complexity of the things that we're dealing with now, we just can't hold it. We can't cope with it. And if we're going to get out of that, we need to accept that we need this transformational intent. Just improving the systems we have now is no longer enough. We've got to create something significantly different, and that requires moving towards something fundamentally different, such as regenerative systems. So we'll need to learn how we do that. I was then suggesting that we need to come back to our senses to feel, imagine, and embody these new futures, and to address many of the other challenges that we have. Coming back to our senses will be absolutely critical. Next slide, please. So I'm going to finish with this. This is a picture of Heather, a friend of mine who lives out in the Isle of Lewis on the west coast of Scotland. She spends huge amounts of time out in nature with her kids, just engaging and being within that. She would describe herself as a healer, a life coach, a word weaver, an artist, and a death doula. If you don't know what that is, she works with people at the end of their lives to give them the most joy she possibly can as they come to the end of their lives. She told me a story of she was working with somebody who was a woman who had dementia and was in a care home, And she described to me, well, we create loads of joy. This woman can't remember when her birthday is, so they have a birthday every week and she brings a cake in, right? And then I think she was telling me the story of how the care home workers were a bit confused when they caught them both climbing out the window. And they said, why are you doing that? Well, she just wanted to go out the window. We just have some fun. Let's go and climb out the window. So that notion of just really bringing joy back into somebody at the end of the life, bringing them back into their senses. And she's known locally as the Joy Witch. She really embodies this sense of joy and this connection to the nature and the world that's around us. And it was, in fact, Heather that inspired me to add this bit into the talk that I was giving about today about our senses. And she wrote a meditation piece, which is about 8 minutes long. It's too long for this. But what I've done is I've summarized it. I've made it shorter. So I'm going to end with this poem. You can call it a poem. You can call it a meditation piece. So I'd invite you, if you feel comfortable with it, you might just want to stop and close your eyes as I go through this towards the end of this talk. So just settle down, just relax, and listen to this for a couple of minutes. When the ache of aliveness creeps out of the closet and desperation to become overpowers the presence to be, listen, oh dear one, come to your senses. When anxiety grips your lungs and breathing is shallow, remember your ribs, be in your bones, let your feet feel the ground and gravity. When you can't take another thought, take another breath. Give into the process, get out of your mind, throw open the doors, and fall into the heart of the wild. Come to your senses. If you find the human world overwhelming, build a den, your own earth lodge. Curry in for time outside of time. Light a fire inside yourself. Oil will still rise to the surface. Bring fire, bring water, bring earth, bring enough air that you hear the wind in the trees. Let leaves rattle until you become hollow, until you become an instrument, until you become the song. Come to your senses. And if comparison bangs from some inner prison in anger, shame or doubt, be kind. Throw yourself a key or lift rush to canvas. What I'm saying is paint your own portrait, unlock your own ancestors. Be sure to let yourself free. Do what needs to be done, my friend. Rest, restore, read your own myths again and again, then pick up pen and paper and write yourself into the next line. Whatever you do, come to your senses. If you've forgotten who you are, follow wild footprints, pick up fallen feathers, go on a treasure hunt, snout to the ground, be lost and find what you're not looking for, and come back to your senses. If you've found yourself heavy with burdens, carry your concerns to the soil, graciously give them away. Don't overcomplicate it. Touch fur, unfurl your grief, let nature adore you, anoint you. Touch it until it adorns you, wraps its resonance around you. Touch it until you feel it. Touch it until you come to your senses. I see you, amongst the trees, sunlight and shadows, more than meets the eye. Let the green breath of birch have a way with you. What else is there to do, O sister, O brother, but unfold into this circle of light? Remember, we are all children of the same mother. Come to your senses and come as you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ioan. That was a lovely end to a fascinating talk. If people have got some questions at all for Ioan, if you want to either put them into the chat, or if you want to say them to yourself, then please, if you can raise a hand under the reactions button on the menu, and then I can unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. Well, I'm giving just a little time to people to phrase their questions. I was just going to ask Ioan, do you think that the last couple of years when we've all isolated ourselves and done our meetings online have set us back in this transformational process? Because although we can see each other and we can hear each other, we're not using all of our senses as you suggest we should be. when we're interacting?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not entirely sure I know which way it goes, but it can go in two ways, because my feeling or sense is that the ability to be able to stop and have that separation and then come back into the world, I think, could be really important. So it might help us to actually remind ourselves of how much or how little we are sensing things. So it gives us a stopgap, if you like, for doing that. The challenge is then, can we get people back into that? And one of the things we're noticing, and I know Felicity's on this call, but she's mentioned it as well, currently the new generation of students that have been coming through are not as interactive as they perhaps would have been coming out through COVID. So that creates some challenges around things like group work and so on that we might be facing. So it's difficult to know which way it's going. My feeling is it was a necessary part for us in some form, but I haven't quite come to a full conclusion yet as to how that plays into particularly the notion of senses. But at the same time, I guess there was quite a lot of interest that people had in getting back out to nature once they realized they couldn't actually access it. So I'd love to hear other thoughts if you have them. And if you don't have questions, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. What do you think?
So we have a question with somebody has asked, how do we use this knowledge and these change in our senses to actually help the planet? There's a key. 64
Yeah,
million.
There's no direct answer there, but really, if we want significant change, we cannot achieve that change without changing and looking inward ourselves as well. In fact, there's a whole range of work. So you're probably familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. There's actually a whole bunch of work that's going on in relation to the inner development goals that are needed as well. So the inside changes. So it goes back to the point I was really making about the systemic changes that we had and how we need to start thinking about changing our worldviews and our paradigms that we're operating in. So it's about really tapping back into that, experience that in a different way, and then finding a way to embody that then generates the change from the outside as well. So that's my answer. It's not an easy one.
So I'm just trying to go down the list. We're getting some more questions in. Can you give any more examples of adopting a more sense-focused knowledge making within the university setting, and how in particular that might have been received?
Yeah, I can give you a really nice example. It's not quite directly on senses, but we're moving towards it in our department. So one of the things we've done in the Department of Environment and Geography, and we've sort of introduced this over the last 3 years, is we're making it very, very explicit what our core values are. So our core values are based on what we think we are as a community. So it's things like striving towards environmental sustainability, embracing diversity, and those sorts of things. We're now using those to hire new staff. So, and what we're finding is that staff are coming to us, they want to work with us because we're being explicit about our values. And so it's a really interesting shift that's starting to happen. We actually had one staff who actually applied for the job because of that, because he saw the values that I want to work there. We've had staff in the past who come to an interview and we ask them in the interview, where have they demonstrated these core values? And then somebody said to me, well, that made me want to come even more. So we're starting to build something that is around the values. We're starting to work with students on that now, in terms of what students we bring in and how we interact. And what that's doing is it's creating a space, I think what it's doing is creating a space where people can come in and feel like they can be themselves. They're bringing that whole person in. So it's not quite directly related to the senses that I'm talking about, but it's creating the space for more of that to happen. The quality or the shift hopefully that what we'll start seeing is a shift in the kinds of conversations we're having, a shift in the relations that we're having with different people within the department as well. And I think we're starting to see something different that's emerging. And I'm really, really excited by that.
So I suppose there's another question which sort of links into that, but also goes back to what I was asking about the sort of lockdown and everyone being isolated, is that would you suggest that when we're bringing people together to explore and interact change, we should look to do this in person rather than online?
Yeah, I was really looking forward to this being online, and Joe and I had a quick chat, on face-to-face, and Joe and I had a chat at the beginning, and it was really difficult, I think, for Joe and the other organisers to make a decision about what this should be like. But there's a slight irony, isn't there? A talk about senses when actually I can't even see any single face other than Joe's on this whole thing. So there's a really interesting thing there that around what we're sensing and what we're feeling and what we're able to do in terms of relating to others. So yes, I definitely think if we can do it face to face, that's good. But it also brings other benefits in terms of being able to link internationally. And Joe was also saying to me earlier that last year they had quite a lot of international people coming in as well. So you might want a bit of both.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions that you will be sent a questionnaire out after One Planet Week to all Eventbrite ticket holders, and what one of the questions we want to know is, would you have come to this talk had it been face to face? Would you have been able to get here? Because it was a decision for us to actually move it online, and it was because when we had the 2 tickets available, most people were choosing online. Sorry, to come back to the questions, we've been aware of the benefits of spending time in nature for some time, and yet there's still quite a disconnect between knowing that benefit and actually doing it. Is there perhaps a need to change the way in which our message on this is being conveyed?
Yeah, it's a tough one. The message is very difficult to get across when people don't experience something. And that has been my own experience of this kind of work, is that really until you can get people who are ready to go and relearn how they're relating to things, it's a very difficult thing to do. You can shout about these things as much as you like. So there's no easy and hard and fast ways of dealing with that, but gradually building that in and starting to introduce the opportunities for it are really key. I think it's also important to recognize that you can do any of these connecting with senses anywhere. You don't have to be in some kind of pristine environment. You know, you can do it with your plant at home. You can do it with your dog. You can do it with your partner. You can do it in all sorts of different ways. But what's really critical is just coming back to your senses and just trying that. And then it takes time. There's no silver bullet, but it is absolutely critical in terms of how we do it. I think the second part then is, I've hinted at this in the education sort of sector. The education sector doesn't really do this. It does in certain areas, and you've got forest schools and you've got these little bits going on, but not in its wider sense of going beyond the epistemic knowledge. There's quite a profound shift that will be needed for us to be able to start recognizing this and rebuilding it back into our societies. And of course, the way things are going from a hyper sort of technological shift that we're starting to see, I'm not sure where that's going to head. My suspicion is we'll probably have parts of society that go fully down this massive technological route, the AI route, the phones and things like that. And then there will be some that decide that it's time to go away from that and will be separate from that. And there'll be opportunities to learn and engage from both sorts of sectors. So I think there's a whole range of things that are starting to unfold, and it's really not clear where this is going.
And another question that's been asked is that, do you have any advice on balancing sensory awareness whilst applying your mind in your studies, or are there ways of incorporating the both?
It's that's a really good question. It's not straightforward. What I find is that personally, I go into one world and then I come out of that world. I've not found it very easy to straddle both. So I'm usually doing one or the other. So when I go into my academic work, I am sort of a much more sort of focused mind kind of thing. When I come out of that, I can then start to engage in other things. But what I do find is when I engage in the other things, I find it incredibly calming and relieving of that tendency to want to just jump in the mind all the time. So I think it's not necessarily a balance. You can find ways of, I'm continuously trying to find ways of being present in both at the same time, but I do find that very difficult. But if you can't do that, then a really helpful thing to do is make sure you've got a counterbalance. So if you're noticing you're heavily in one area, you go into the other area and vice versa. So you can try and find that. It's a bit of a misnomer, I think, to have a balance, but you can always have a counterbalance when you recognize that you're going too heavily into one rather than the other. And that's what I find. I might go for a week and I'm going, crikey, I'm so much in my head. Right, okay, let's go and focus on try and come back to my senses a bit more and do that in a certain way.
I've always find cycling home from work has always been a great sort of, yes, switch off but also coming up with some of my best ideas when you get detached.
Yeah. It's actually when you let go of it all that you find that the great ideas pop up. My problem there is that when the great ideas pop up, I start going on a mind train sort of thing, and it's like, no, stop, that wasn't the point.
So you talked about how universities operate. How do you envisage this approach changing the pedagogy?
That's an interesting one as well. So the way I approach that is that I try and at least make a shift into trying to help students learn about the how. So it's not a full into the sensory mode. I don't think the systems we've got in the universities are really set up for that in terms of things like timetable, classes and class sizes. But what I try and do is get them into thinking about moving into learning about how you think about producing change. And often that is about then handing over much more of the responsibility of the learning to the students. So it's more like facilitating their work rather than teaching them. I don't really like teaching because I don't find that particularly inspiring if I'm just talking about stuff. But the actual getting students to work on group projects where they're trying to get their sense and developing their change plans and so on is a helpful way to get into that. And depending on where the students are and what's happening in that particular mode, what I then do is I might take them that a little bit further to get them to think about or engage with something around their senses towards the end. But it's kind of it's almost like you've got to take them out of what they're used to, because even just doing facilitation, handing over the ownership of the learning to them can be really challenging for them if they've really just had an education in a particular form. So it's kind of knowing, for me, where the different steps are, where the different stages of people are, and then massaging that and trying to find a way as quickly as possible bringing these other things in.
So I think by the looks of it, we might have come to the end of the list of questions that we were asked, and unless anyone has got another one they want to sneak in at the end. But no, I think you've answered all the questions we have. Thank you. And so it just remains for me to say thank you very much for a fascinating talk. It has been recorded, as you know. We put up messages to say this was being recorded. We are going to load the talk onto the Sustainability YouTube channel once we've topped and tailed it and just taken out the bit at the beginning where Ioan and I were just chatting about things. And that should be up on the YouTube later next week. If you are interested in other things going on in One Planet Week, we have arranged more talks going on throughout the week. And if you want to practice coming to your senses and you're able to, you can join us for one of the guided walks that we have on campus at lunchtime for each day this week, where you will be shown some of the beautiful nature that we have on Campus West by one of our volunteers taking you around, and you can take some time to really enjoy some of the sites we pass every day without even looking at normally. So thank you very much, Ioan, and thank you very much to everyone for coming along. I hope you have enjoyed it, and will join us again for another session. Thank you.
Thank you.